Okay, so the first session is on civility and democracy. And in this session, we want to create an understanding of the current state of civil discourse in Australia and the level of civility displayed in political discussion. And we will discuss topics such as how mainstream media promotes or hinders civil dialogue, how we encourage broader society to participate in democratic discourse, and how social media has changed the game. And I'm very pleased now to introduce my friend, my former colleague, and my colleague again in CHASS, Emeritus Professor Stephen Schwartz, AM. Stephen is the Executive Director of CHASS. He was formerly the VC of Macquarie and also served as VC of Brunel in London and VC of Murdoch in Perth. He's held positions at the University of Texas, Queensland, Western Australia, and most recently at Oxford University. He's a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, an Academy of Social Science Royal Exchange Fellow, a NATO Fellow, a World Health Organization Fellow, a Fellow of the Australian Institute of Management and the Australian Institute of Company Directors. In addition to his role at CHASS, he's Chairman of the Fulbright Commission, Senior Advisor at the Nous Group, and a member of the boards of charitable, government and private organisations. He's received numerous scholarly prizes and grants and is the author of 13 books and more than 120 scientific articles and hundreds of newspaper and magazine articles. And it gives me great pleasure, Stephen, to introduce you today.
Thank you very much, John. One of the very nice things about retiring from a job as Vice-Chancellor is people start saying nice things about you. I'm going to have to try to get used to it. In 1998, the New York Times newspaper ran an article on its front page, and the headline on the article was, "Be polite or else." And the story under it was about the mayor of the time, who was Rudolph Giuliani, but everyone called Rudy Giuliani, about his program to transform New York City from a famously gritty city to a peaceful and serene urban oasis where all of the residents were charming and gracious and polite to each other all the time. And he based the theory that of what he was going to do on the famous broken window hypothesis, sociological hypothesis, that says that when you start allowing minor misdemeanors in a community, it kind of sets the scene for social disintegration and major crimes and incivilities follow. So he translated that to what he called zero tolerance. And he was going to crack down on speeders, jaywalkers, litterers, graffiti artists, people who blow their horns too loud, and anyone else who interferes with the domestic tranquility. Now, in the press conference that this article was reporting on, Mayor Giuliani was asked whether he was worried that this kind of policy, this zero tolerance approach, would rob the city of its vitality and its spontaneity, and people's self-expression might be curtailed. And Giuliani answered, and he said that, well, self-expression is very good, but anarchy is not. And common sense says you have to draw the line somewhere. And that makes sense, doesn't it? But where? Where do you draw that line? In practice, it's not always so easy to draw a line between robust criticism and passionate advocacy. These are important things to the working of any democracy, and without them we wouldn't achieve anything. But what happens when that robust criticism and passion gets translated and degenerates into expressions of hatred, of vilification, of contempt and distrust for your adversaries? Well, we know what happens. Nothing gets done. So somewhere a line does have to exist. 2,000 years ago, Cicero famously said, "O tempora, o mores," and we're still saying the same thing today. But hopefully after this session, we'll have a solution. Because this session includes expert panelists who are going to directly tackle the issue of how to maintain civility and democracy at the same time. Now, here's how the session is going to work. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers individually, one at a time, and ask each speaker to talk to you for 10 minutes I'll make some sort of noise around 10 so they know the time's up. When the last speaker is finished, then it's your turn to enter in it. We'll have microphones. You can make statements, ask questions, and get involved in the debate. And at 10:25, we'll wrap up and everyone will get a well-deserved cup of coffee. So let me get started. Our first speaker today, and I have great pleasure to introduce him, is Dr. Andrew Leigh. Dr. Leigh is a member of the House of Representatives for the Fraser electorate here in the ACT. He's also Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister. Andrew's a lawyer by training and has served as an associate to Justice Michael Kirby. He holds degrees from Sydney University and Harvard, where he received his doctorate. In his presentation today, Andrew's going to try to answer the question, how bad is it now compared to the past? So please join me in welcoming Andrew Leigh to the podium.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for that most civil of introductions. Can I, like Auntie Agnes, acknowledge we're meeting today on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I want to thank CHASS for inviting me back to this very vibrant forum. It's something I look forward to a great deal, and this particular talk is one that has been rattling around my head ever since I was invited to deliver it, which I think reflects on the importance of the topic. So since we're talking about civility, I reached into my bookshelves and I pulled out what I think must be the essential tome that one begins such a discussion with. This is Paul Keating's Book of Insults. I shall now proceed by reading you a few of them. On John Hewson, his performance was like being flogged with a warm lettuce. On Andrew Peacock, I suppose that the honourable gentleman's hair, like his intellect, will recede into the darkness. On John Howard, he is the greatest job and investment destroyer since the bubonic plague. This is 1984. And on Nick Greiner, look at Greiner, he's only 2 years old and already he's terminal. And I start with Keating to illustrate the basic point that defining civility is tricky. I'm going to take that back. Do you mind if we lose this chart, whoever's doing the magical AV? Just make it go away. Fabulously. Good. Lovely. Thank you. Because graphs are distracting if they're not what you're talking about. Defining civility is tricky. We know the extremes, absolute rudeness and genteel politeness, as Stephen has illustrated in his most genteel of introductions. But in the middle is a grey area where one person's incivility is another's witticism. I could spend 10 minutes on that alone, so I'm simply going to use the elephant definition that most of us know incivility when we see it. And so I want to ask two questions today. The first is politics getting less civil? And the second is, what can we do to improve it? And note that these two questions don't depend on one another. Even if politics isn't becoming less civil, one might well want it to become more civil. So the starting point is that Australian voters have never had a particularly high view of their politicians. This is a quote on federal parliament. The standard of debate and discussion is appallingly low. The intelligence and purposefulness of those taking part less than evident. No country deserves politicians as bad as these. That's Craig McGregor writing in 1966. And since the 1960s, we have empirical evidence on the point. Australian election studies in successive years have asked the question of respondents, in general, do you feel that the people in government are too often interested in looking after themselves? Or do you feel they can be trusted to do the right thing nearly all the time? In the late 1960s, about half of Australian respondents said that politicians could be trusted to do the right thing nearly all the time. And by the 2000s, that figure was down to around 40%. A slight drop, but not off a particularly high base. Around half of Australians for the last 40 years have thought that politicians couldn't be trusted. Roy Morgan is another source of data. Their Image of Professions survey asks Australians to rate professions for ethics and honesty. The profession that I used to be in, and which most of you are in, that of university lecturers, about 80% of Australians rate university lecturers high or very high for ethics or honesty. By contrast, my current profession of federal politics, about 10 to 20% of Australians rate federal politicians high or very high for ethics or honesty. It was, in the most recent survey, 14%, which means that we are down the level of newspaper journalists. This is, as I regard it, a serious problem. Looking across countries, we also have evidence that Australians hold their politicians in fairly low regard. A survey in the 1990s asked people in 16 countries whether they had confidence in their national parliament. The average, 43% of respondents in the typical country said they had confidence in the national parliament. 31% of Australian respondents had confidence in their national parliament. And the problem is so bad that when I, in 2002, co-edited a book with David Birchall called The Prince's New Clothes, Why Do Australians Distrust Their Politicians? The problem was regarded as so bad by my editor that they placed as a cover image a picture of one dog sniffing another dog's backside. The unfortunate effect of this was that the Parliamentary Library the Parliamentary bookstore out the front decided that it couldn't stock this most uncivil of books. So at least somebody in this building has some decorum. Another way of looking at how things have changed over time is to look at parliamentary behaviour. And now I will go to that first slide, which you got a sneak peek of before. And in this, what I've done is gone back through Hansard and in every year counted the number of times that two measures of incivility are mentioned. The number of times the words liar or liar are used, and the number of times the word unparliamentary is used, a typical objection to people who are behaving in an uncivil way. And I've normalised that by the number of words spoken in Parliament over the year, and so the average across the period is 10. So years in which there is more incivility are above 10, and less incivility are below 10. And what I saw surprised me. The periods of greatest incivility are the early 1950s, the late 1970s, and the early 1990s. And in fact, on this fairly narrow measure of incivility, incivility is down in the federal parliament. But on other measures, I think there are issues with civility. I had two of my interns, Ellen and Eleanor, this week, walk around all of the federal parliamentary offices. And I asked them to look at a simple thing. I asked them to look at the posters in each window. And for parliamentarians who had a political poster up, I asked them to write down whether that was a positive poster, speaking about the good things that members or senators' party was doing, or a negative poster, attacking the other party. And this is what I found. Of the 99 offices in this building that depict a parliamentary political poster in the window, 42 of them are negative posters. So 42% of the federal parliament on this measure self-define to their colleagues through a negative lens rather than a positive lens. They define through their colleagues by a measure of what they're against rather than what they're for. And in other areas too, I think we've seen a greater rise in nastiness. One driver of that, I believe, is anonymity. In my 2010 book, Disconnected, I talked about some of the evidence on how anonymous technologies can make interactions nasty. I quoted an experiment run at the University of Texas, Austin, in which students were placed in separate booths and asked to communicate with one another only by email. And the experimenters were surprised to see how quickly the conversations turned lewd or rude. At the end of the article, they noted, "The male experimenter who concluded the sessions debriefed the participants immediately after the interactions without reading the transcripts. He noted the students were always low-keyed, unassuming, and moderately interested in the study. No participants appeared embarrassed, shocked, or in the slightest way upset or angry. At the conclusion of the project, when he was given the opportunity to read the transcripts, he was astounded, even overwhelmed, to learn the nasty things that these polite students had been saying to one another." And if you've ever said anything nastier over email than you'd say in person, you know how it can happen. In the Australian Moment, George Megalogenis discusses the text messages that in part prompted the Cronulla riots and some of the nastiness in certain corners of the blogosphere. And he argues, quote, "The common sense filters that were used to keep the letters to the editor page civil and to prevent the cranks from getting on air don't apply in cyberspace because it rewards those who generate the most outrage." I find this too as a federal member of Parliament. People will occasionally say harsh things to your face. But on any given day, my inbox and my Twitter feed include nastier comments than anything that anyone will say to my face over a matter of months. Here's an example, and I apologise for the purple prose, but we're discussing civility, and so its flip side, incivility, is, I think, worth mentioning. This is an email that arrived in my inbox. I'll get you to answer the multiple choice question as to who sent it to me. Shall I read it to you? So that either came from an opposing party candidate, it came from an angry voter, or it came from a senior journalist. Make your guess. So, candidate, voter, journalist. There you are, journalist. So that's our challenge. And now I turn to the question, what is to be done? I think the challenges that I've spoken about pose a particular challenge to progressives. If we look around the world, I don't think it's an accident that social democratic governments are a little thin on the ground at exactly the time when the media landscape's fragmenting. Because I think the technological changes that have driven anonymous technologies and electronic communication aren't ideologically neutral. In that, I think of Twitter, I think of elements of the blogosphere, I think of 24-hour news and a lot of electronic interaction. I think those technologies are particularly beneficial for populists and libertarians. I think they're particularly detrimental for long-game reformers. So the challenge for people like me is to continue to talk about big ideas. And reform, if you look in the past, I think there's something to be said for this. Reforms like Medicare, universal superannuation, expanding university places and dropping the tariff barriers didn't happen by themselves. They were the product of passionate and painstaking advocacy. And people like me need to get better at linking the reforms of the present to the past. Humans are fundamentally storytelling creatures, and we need to be clear that reform isn't about uprooting our history. It's about linking the story of what's happening now with the story of the past. But I don't think this is just something that social democrats should be concerned about. I think there's other good reasons to improve civility too. We know from the medical literature, for example, that there's a strong link between hostility and coronary heart disease. So politicians who are attacking one another in the nastiest of terms are potentially sending themselves to an early grave. And finally, I think politeness is simply more interesting. I engage in a semi-regular discussion with Liberal Senator Arthur Sinodinos on ABC Radio National. And one of the things that the producers will often tell me is they get feedback from listeners saying that they find the fact that Arthur and I have great respect for one another and will often speak in glowing terms about the other person's capacity makes the discussion over policy and the sharp policy differences much more listenable. So ultimately, I think not only is civility good in itself, but potentially it's good politics as well. Thanks very much.
Eventually, we're all going to be sitting up here, but everybody wants to see one another's slides, which makes sense, including me. Thank you very much, Andrew. That's a great start to this, and I think we'll be picking up a number of those themes as we go along. I'd now like to introduce the second of our speakers, and that's Iain Walker. Iain's the Executive Director of the newDemocracy Foundation, which is an organization dedicated to reforming how government works, specifically by making it less adversarial. Iain's had a career in commerce and sport and holds degrees from Sydney University and UTS. In his talk today, he's going to focus on why our political system does seem to lead to incivility, and maybe even some pointers about what to do about it. So please welcome Iain Walker.
Good morning. As I got the invitation from CHASS for the talk today, I must say what immediately popped into my mind is a comment that's made to me quite often. Why is it that in Canberra, people seem to fight like cats in a sack? I'm not sure if you're aware of this phrase, fairly common, that cats in a sack, think of your sack, put a couple of cats in, they're not particularly happy to be in there, and all they do is react. They're not their normal, wonderful, cat-like self. And yet our solution, quite frequently, is to look at this problem, look at this shaking bag of cats, and say, you know what we need to do? Put different cats in there. What I want to step through with you today is perhaps it's not the cats, it's the sack. I don't mean to start with a Dr. Seuss style theme, but it's very much a case that this is not a case of trying to find better people. There's a certain set of people who see the Prime Minister being treated very harshly. There's a certain set of people who see former Prime Minister Howard or the opposition leader being treated very harshly. I don't think that's a function of anyone's personality. This is a function of the system we've designed. What I see are very intelligent operators using a system in the natural way. So what I want to start to lead into is, what is it that drives this behaviour? So for today, I want to offer a short vox pop view of what a source of the problem is, and with a sense of hope, a couple of options for how we might innovate our way out of it. Because fundamentally, that's what we at the Foundation try to do, is we're trying to offer ways to innovate in democracy. We recognise that it can be hard for someone in any political role to offer that, for fear that a cynical public will think that you're just trying to help your own side of politics. So we work with elected representatives from also all parts of the spectrum to try to introduce, fund and operate any innovations. So what do we see? We see vox pop democracy. Now, it's absolutely fundamental that what we've created in voting is the ultimate low involvement consumer product. Trying to get my vote, you can send me 20 pages of documents on policy A and what you hope to achieve. Or you can make the other person look distrustworthy, look like a disgrace. And I'll give you a tip, this is easier. It is very hard to sell high involvement detail, and what is tracked, it is much simpler to go high in conflict because people respond to it. And I don't mean people out there, I mean all of us. There's a principle, and it's been alluded to in my commercial past. When buying cars, people don't actually weigh up all the details. Despite spending $30,000, $40,000, $100,000 on the car, people don't compare technical features. You make an emotional decision, and then you rationalise it. You take that emotional decision, then you rationalise it. How do many people vote? You go for that emotional reaction. And that's what we'd see as part of the flaw that we've built in to the electoral model that we've got today. However, it's not cause to abandon ship. We simply need to look at the structures which drive that and potentially see, well, how would we remedy that? There's three ideas I'd hope to land with you today and to start to stimulate that conversation. Progressively more adventurous. The starting one is an interesting one, and it comes down to tone of language and what we're allowed to say. Many of you will be familiar, we have a Trade Practices Act, which applies to every business out there about statements with the intent or likely effect to mislead or deceive. And gosh, just a couple of months away, we'll see about $110 million spent on advertising, which is exempt from that requirement. It's actually the only area of political speech which is exempt from the Trade Practices Act. You are actually permitted to mislead or deceive. Now, it's been something that's been put to us by a range of, it's actually from the legal community. Julian Burnside is a QC who champions this idea specifically. We have a justice system that is eminently well qualified to judge that. And we have a mechanism of remedy in the electoral funding per vote that could be applied to taper that. And probably like the elephant definition, it's something that is clearly apparent when you see it. And this is not a comment on either side of politics. The game of securing votes itself rewards extreme behaviour. By having a counterbalancing factor, it can be the case that we can start to maybe restore a little bit more civility by knocking out abject extremism. Now, I want to go into a more controversial topic that could see me out on the concourse in about 4 minutes' time. We were given, about 3 weeks after he retired, Lindsay Tanner gave us a few papers which he described as where the bodies are buried. And for a year, he asked that his name not be put to it. Now he's a little more relaxed. And he pointed to an interesting change in structure, that when he entered Parliament 30 or so years ago, most MPs had a single member of staff. And if you have one member of staff, you get someone who is probably got a little more grey hair than I do, and actually offers you that wisdom and insight and advice. Now, with the passage of time, and I stand to be corrected, but Lindsay's view was the average MP now gets, on average, you end up with 6 full-time roles for those in your parliamentary staff, which if you're smart, you can break into a couple of full-time and then break the others into part-time roles. So in all, you'll start to see around about 1,500 staffers around the place. And a key incentive of doing this arduous role of working ridiculous number of hours is that it does provide an inside track into the pre-selection system. So we did a little bit of analysis ourselves and started to say, for those we would classify as insiders, for those we would classify maybe, it's become a terrible term, but as career politicians, those who have gone from student politics to a staffer role and ultimately become a representative. And we set a simple line, and indeed an arbitrary line, of less than 5 years of work experience outside that. I think you'd be quite surprised how low that number is. That what we're starting to build is an environment where those who do work within these halls, within these walls, it can be quite an excessively adversarial workplace. So if you start to draw all your representatives from within this type of work environment, it will breed incivility. And indeed, the point that Lindsay made is, anytime you have a funnel of 1,500 people competing for 150 potential places, who stands out? The most adversarial, the strongest, those who come up with the catchiest, bitingest lines that don't need to be accurate, that you could start to punch and land that point. It's interesting the solution he raised, and I was mindful of that as I believe, Dr. Leigh, I saw you having to stand last Thursday with regards to the additional funding for the electoral reimbursement. Sorry, my language abandons me. And that we as a foundation look at the difficulty of vox pop democracy, because citizens look at an extra $1 per vote, and let me tell you, they're outraged. Equally, citizens look at corporate donations, and let me tell you, they're outraged. And we look at union funding into political parties. Now take a step back. That's public opinion. What we are seeking is public judgment. How could we get a trusted decision on how we are to fund our democracy? We have a barrier of trust. Now, any time, be it someone from the government, someone from the opposition, an independent, someone from the Greens, whoever it is, whoever stands up and says, I have a different way to fund our democracy, good luck. You are drawing a bullseye on yourself. And it's that path that we've ceased to trust people and we cease to find a way to land ideas in a trusted fashion. That is something that we would offer an idea of how to address. The contention I'd put to you, if I was to tell you we'd randomly selected a jury of about 150 citizens across the country, not in an opinion poll, in the opposite, And we put to them the challenge, in this case, how would you like to pay for our democracy? An open question, time, information and authority. I'll give you 6 months. I don't need to rush you through a weekend-style process. I want you to read. I want you to select your own experts that you trust. You'll probably choose to hear from MPs, from academics, from a range of people. And if they can find something approaching consensus, not a unanimous set, but if 140 out of those 150 people returned and said, actually, this is how I think we'd fund it, then we would start to get past that vox pop challenge today, where it's easy to object to every single thing in a public opinion way, but public judgment is something that's completely different. And that's where we start to look at the role of, is it the electoral system itself is what we've just varied? We will always want to vote and elect some representatives, but in an environment where there is a hyper-adversarialism and a lack of trust, is there a counterbalancing that can occur with a jury-style structure? What I hope I've conveyed today is the simple idea that it's the very nature of needing to get elected and so maybe some of the limited regulation on the behaviour that we allow in doing that leads to a position of incivility. This is not a question of personality. I think you could put anyone in this room in either of the role of the Prime Minister or the opposition leader, pick who you love, pick who you hate, but the way they act is rational, sensible and logical, so it's time to change the sack and not the cats. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Iain. Well done. And that gives us a lot to add to our considerations here. Our next speaker is one of the national leaders in the higher education scene in Australia. She's Jeannie, and she's president of the National Tertiary Education Union, which is the largest union in the higher education sector and one of the largest unions in Australia. In addition to the NTEU work, Jeannie's had a 30-year career in higher education, most recently at Victoria University. And she's, in her remarks, is going to look at the issue of civility, and this is very timely, I'm sure you'll agree, through the frame of women in public life. So please join me in welcoming Jeannie to the podium.
Thank you, Stephen, for that nice introduction. Unfortunately, we're not one of the largest unions, but we do try and always have tried to punch above our weight, as we put it. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we meet today, the Ngunnawal, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also to any other Indigenous people that are with us today. I'd also like to acknowledge the terrific work that CHASS has done over the years that it's been in operation and organising, and the continuing need for that advocacy for the humanities and social sciences, the humanities, arts and social sciences. It is something, I suppose, which we do find, those of us in the field, incongruous, that it is indeed the area where so many people study and graduate and work and go on to other careers in this house. And then we find that we have a lot of trouble being heard. But interestingly, in my role in the union, I also engage with the science and technology equivalent, the STA, who of course, they spend their time complaining that all those very, very articulate people from the humanities, arts and social sciences get all the attention and the scientists don't get any. So there you are, that's how it works out. I think when we join together is when we actually do get somewhere. And on the basis of our support for CHASS, we're very pleased to be a sponsor of this conference, which I think, of course, is very timely. And I do appreciate the opportunity to speak here. And yes, I was going to focus on, actually not dissimilarly to where Andrew and Iain were speaking, and looking at the structures and culture of civic engagement, of that ways of trying, and one of the questions we're asked to ponder upon of how broader society could be better encouraged to participate. And I was reflecting upon my own experience and my own experience in the labour movement, but also as a feminist in the labour movement, and which is, and of course the labour movement reflects, I suppose, the formal and legal structures around it too, which are necessarily adversarial. You can't enter into a legal and formal process to deal with industrial relations without creating a dispute. You actually have to find sides. Sharon Bird made the comment of the tradition in Parliament, you have to have sides, 2 swords apart. In fact, I didn't know that. So when you construct the system that has to put people in opposition, you have to find a side. You have to have a binary sides. Trying to find another spot within that is very difficult. And that has actually been one of the things for feminists engaging in the labour movement and indeed in politics, has been one of those challenges when I suppose part of the discourse of feminism in academia, but more broadly in politics, has been around that things aren't that simple and aren't able to be seen that way. So I was going to talk about that, and I had prepared a nice piece to present to you, but I just had to change my topic. And really, after the last week in politics in Australia, or in public life in Australia, there wasn't much civility being displayed in the political discussion, and it was, and I even still at the end of last week was still working with my initial topic I wished to talk on. But then I suppose I got even more annoyed because that was last week's news. And so now all of those things that dominated the media, public, political agenda last week around women have now gone, because now we're on to something else, and then it will all come back again. And I think that says something too about the media cycle and the ways that these things work too, which will be, I'm sure we'll have much discussion about today. But last week we did have a scenario, which has been going on for some time, where our Prime Minister's gendered and sexed body was the direct canvas for her political opponents. We had, and I'm not going to go into details of it because I'm not going to help it along. There was the Liberal fundraising menu case, and then there was the Perth radio commentator who used questioning the Prime Minister's partner's sexuality for actually making a point, and a very, very nasty point, which was really a commentary, and it was actually a women's studies academic at Melbourne University, Lauren Rosewarne, who pointed this out. The undercurrent of that was really about looking at the undesirability of the Prime Minister on any level, and that's getting to a pretty ugly way of looking at it. So, if civility is about looking to the merits of an argument, to listening, to being broad-minded, to being inclusive, and these are fundamental liberal democratic concepts that go with the notion of democracy. It's not what's happening here, because the reality is we haven't got terribly far in accepting the participation of women in public life. It's not at all surprising that this issue of participation of women in the public sphere, in public life, was the focus of feminists going back centuries ago, in the 19th and even in the 18th century, where women were focused on getting the vote, therefore to get an avenue into public life, getting into paid work, into education, into the universities. And many of you here, because of your area of disciplinary interests in the arts, humanities and social sciences, are well aware of these things. Yeah, that there is still a long way to go is clear as you walked into this theatre today, that there is, and it's a very good thing, a display picturing every woman member of the House of Representatives and the Senate to date. And so, yeah, now in the Senate we're getting towards half women. It's still a long way to go in the House of Representatives. So the barriers are still there, and there are, of course, in many places in the world, still the physical prohibitions on women being in the public places and being permitted to speak. And so much of the focus around women in public life has, of course, been on getting more women in there and getting a critical mass. And in universities today, we've achieved the critical mass of there are now a majority of women staff and women students. But yet, last year, with the National Union of Students, the NTEU, brought back Blue Stocking Week. Blue stockings were the names given to women of earlier times. It goes back to a rather nice book someone just gave me, goes back to the 18th century salons of clever women wanting to be involved in discussing important things. And indeed, in this book, it just says, the blue stocking described a literary or learned woman, and has a curious and fascinating history, and goes on to talk about how it was about women trying to change attitudes towards women. It involved men and women. It was used in a disparaging sense and continued to be used in a disparaging sense as women fought to be involved in universities through the last century or so. So why now that we have more women than men, to always put it in that adversarial way, in our universities, did the students and the union representing staff in the universities decide to bring back Blue Stocking Week? Well, because it's not all easy and it's not all going all that well at all, really. The students had been spending a lot of time dealing with issues about the safety of women on campuses, the physical safety, let alone getting on, I suppose, to the emotional and psychological safety of what they were trawling through some of the canons and some of the content of what they're being taught and how they're being taught. I found this a little incongruous, and indeed the Women's Committee of the Union, which included a number of us who are teachers in women's studies or have been, that the sorts of things we said some decades ago now, younger women, and not just younger women, but also older women coming into university still saying today. We still have very, very strong disciplinary and occupational segregation, including in our universities. We might have a majority of women, but only about a quarter of academic women are in the professoriate. So, yeah, there's a long way to go. There's a lot to be done there. But I make this point because it's part of, I have the assumption of, what are you carrying on about? Why are you carrying on about these issues if you reach a critical mass? What's become interesting, particularly in North America, there's a discourse emerging around the problem for universities today is a problem of too many women. It's too many women in universities, which is putting the men off wanting to go because there's too many women, they'll be taught by women. The standards are falling, they're letting too many low-level women into the universities as students, as staff. It's very dangerous. That sort of discussion's not going on here. But again, it's one about, from the argument I'm putting today, about it's not become, I suppose, normalised that women are there. So that being physically present isn't enough. And it does go beyond just looking at the physical presence. It's not about how women look, and it's not about furfies like Germaine Greer, talking about the Prime Minister wears unflattering jackets, and it's not about the Prime Minister going on about blue ties and the men, and so that marks what's going on. It is actually about that we do have sexed and gendered bodies, and they are, as NUS used for their Blue Stocking Week slogan this year, these things are on the line. When it comes to women, our public participation is still written on our bodies. Not saying that, and in much feminist discourse, the argument has been you can't take the mind from the body and so on, it is all part of it. The issue still remains that it becomes an issue in public life for women in a way it doesn't for men. For women, we're always packaged in our female bodies. Our femaleness is always there to be remarked upon. So now I'll go to some of last week's wonderful moments. When the Socceroos coach made the comment about women, a disparaging comment about women, he made it because he was spoken to or there was a woman there. So it was that she was a woman, that she was seen as such, made it easy. Our women's bodies remain acted upon and indeed violated. The latest scandal at the ADF, and it's sorrowful that it is the latest scandal, being testimony to that. It's the one about the members of the ADF filming and then emailing sex acts with women that they didn't know that they were being filmed. Now, what was interesting, I think, in that case, well, apart from that these things keep going on, is that the male military leader who did the right thing and made very, very firm statements about this will not be tolerated and if this is what you reckon is okay, we'll just get out, He was then hailed in parts of the media as in the darling of the feminists, and that wasn't, that was a criticism, that wasn't a positive. And indeed, he was spoken about in a way which was to demean him as a military leader, that being still seen as a very masculinist role. And indeed, that got taken up in the talk along with the Prime Minister Gillard's response on the Blues Ties speech about criticism of these things because they're about playing the gender card. And this seems to be the expression of the day, the playing the gender card. That was taken up by the social media activist group Get Up, who did actually, and this is again part of what we might talk about in discussion, is the way that these online advocacy is used. But the response of Get Up was one which then went on about, well, yeah, there's a good reason for playing the gender card because women's earnings are still so much less than men's. Only 3% of women are on the ASX 200 CEOs. Women are more likely to be victims, and so on and so forth. And again, amongst this group, I don't need to go through those people here. I would be well aware of where there still remains a lack of gender equity. So it was a bad week for those, whether it's called playing the gender card or because the gender card does exist. What it creates, though, is this conundrum of it becomes impossible to criticise our Prime Minister's performance as Prime Minister without this being mediated through her being a woman, because she is. And she is our first woman Prime Minister. And it's in a political system where women leaders have been often put up to fail. So it's the moment the women leaders come in too. So that doesn't help either. But Julia Gillard is a feminist and she's a Labor feminist. So she is actually expected to follow through on things like she championed the case of low-paid women workers in the community sector as a member of Parliament, indeed when she was a Labor lawyer. Took that through, made sure the funding came through to help improve that gap in pay. That was seen as something she should be doing. She wasn't criticised for that. But she was criticised by Labor feminists and many others when single mothers got dumped onto the dole. For supporting the Labor hack and numbers man, David Feeney, for Batman when it was supposed to be, I understand from all of us who aren't in the Labor Party, but we read it through the media, that this was about, that it was supposed to be a seat lined up for a woman under their rules about affirmative action and so on and so forth. So then she's judged as by feminists or as a feminist for making some of these bad decisions. It's actually not about her female body then, it is actually about her politics, because being a feminist is about politics. But it's not and so I can make that distinction, and I'll think that through, but it isn't easy. And it isn't easy to keep that distinction up, as much feminist theory says. We are always embodied. But I think it is the point we have to recognise that and improve our behaviour. A couple of nights ago, I watched Trish Crossan, the senator from Northern Territory, give her valedictory speech. Senator Crossan, as you may remember earlier this year, was, and I'll just use it colloquially, was sacked by the Prime Minister from her Senate seat to be replaced by Julia Gillard's captain's pick, as she put it, Nova Peris, to put the first Indigenous woman in the Senate. Big move for the Labor Party. What was lost there was Trish Crossan was in the middle of a pre-selection contest with an Aboriginal woman, a long-time Labor woman. So that was an issue, and it was an issue which got some coverage, but not so much that was feminised, because this was, except in some cases where it was seen as this was women up against one another. And that's always, got a bit of interest. The issue there was an issue around proper processes, and it was an issue around, indeed, the involvement of both Julia Gillard and Trish Crossan in Labor Party efforts to increase the status of women and women winning pre-selection, which they'd both been involved in. So it was about women dumping on women, and better was expected. Now, what was interesting in Trish Crossan's farewell speech was that whilst I suspect there was, and I haven't attended many valedictory speeches in Parliament, There was probably more focus on thanking staff, thanking family than maybe some of the men do. I may be giving them a disservice, but there was very much, I think, a womanly approach to that. But much of the speech by both Senator Crossan and others, both from her side of politics and from the opposition, were to have an opportunity, and not surprisingly, the speakers, most of the speakers on the Labor side for Tricia Crossan were from the Rudd side. Yeah, there's some issues going on there. It's for Andrew to talk about, not me. And but it wasn't done in a sexist way, or not talk about. It wasn't done in a sexist way. It was done in a way of, it was a political context, and that was a noticeable thing. So I suppose the point I'm making here is it doesn't have to be always embodied in being a woman, but it does very, very readily. So Julia Gillard has taken these on. The famous misogyny speech, as it's now called, was heartfelt. It did speak to women, and it spoke to men too, and it was about, this is just not right, this goes on and on. That it came out of an ugly situation, again, with a lot of sexism in it, didn't matter in the end to those listening to the speech. So to finish, what I want to say is it brings back to very much the point of what we want, what we do need to see is, I suppose, a much more civil discussion, whether some of that can be done in the social media. I think others have already said there are some problems there. I think actually it also does give people a chance to speak, but the point is it has to actually get off the social media and out of the internet, and to use former Prime Minister John Howard, who's speaking here this afternoon, it has to become a water cooler discussion. And then I think the civility does have to actually improve, because when you're talking directly with the colleagues and the people you work with, you do have to be better, I suppose. So, but to sum up here, what I was wanting to say is that I think we still have a long way to go for women to be separated from being seen just through their bodies, and not just through their clothing, through their bodies, through that they are there and they are women, or we are women, and this hasn't changed. Men still aren't seen in the same way, and we still have a long way to go in this country. And it's interesting that when I said to Stephen, oh look, I really do want to talk about the women in public life things, but I'm sure many other people are addressing it, and he said, oh no, that hadn't come up yet. So there you are. I'll finish there, thank you.
Thank you, Jeannie, and I'm sure it has come up now, and it will certainly come up in the discussion, so thanks for bringing it in. Last but not least of our speakers today, our last speaker, is Alex Oliver. Yes, I knew there was one more. And I'd like to introduce her to you now. Alex is a research fellow at the Lowy Institute for International Policy. She's a lawyer. She's doing research on a variety of different areas in international diplomacy, but also public opinion. And Alex is going to discuss a recent Lowy Centre poll, which seems to suggest that Australians, particularly young ones, may not fully still appreciate the blessings of democracy. So join me, please, in welcoming Alex Oliver to the podium.
I have some slides. Actually, I have loads of slides. I hope that's that you can keep up. Yes, no, I realise that. And I know you're all ready to go to tea. Could I have my PowerPoint, please? Anybody? Look, thank you very much, Professor. Thank you, Andrew, Iain and Jeannie, for giving me such hard acts to follow. I'd like to start with some thoughts about democracy in general, as the Professor foreshadowed. I'd always assumed that democracy in Australia was a given and that it was generally accepted as the best and fairest form of government. However, is that better? In our 2012 poll, we asked some 1,005 Australians how they valued democracy. We asked this question in other countries as well, in which we conducted polling earlier, and we're interested to see what Australians themselves thought about democracy, not just in the abstract, but as it applied to them. And it's coming. It's not that one. It might be that one. It says that's not the title of it. It said Lowy Institute. Is anybody there? Hey, listen, I'm just going to keep going. Look, the results of the study were surprising, if not something of a shock. It says Democracy, Civility, and says the Lowy Institute on the title. I did send it through yesterday, it was received, so. The results were very surprising. They suggested that only 60% of Australians of voting age thought that democracy was preferable to any other kind of government. Of particular concern were the 15% of Australians who said it didn't matter what kind of government we have. Looking at the other countries in which we've asked exactly the same question, it would be really helpful if I had my slides. We've done polling in India, in Indonesia, and in Fiji as well, and we found that Australians are less supportive of democracy than they are in India, which is a newer democracy than ours, in Indonesia, an emerging democracy, and ahead of only Fiji, which is not a democracy at all. I wanted to have a look at 18 to 29-year-olds. The results came as a particular shock last year, and we found that 18 to 29-year-olds, actually only 40% of them, thought that democracy was the most preferable form of government. I'm going to stray into dangerous territory here and make a gross generalisation by using the term Gen Y, or millennials, as we sometimes call them. Pew Research Organisation in the US puts the start of Gen Y at around 1977, which makes the eldest Gen Y at somewhere in the mid-30s. But generally around 18 to 29. I wanted to overlay on my chart, which isn't here, the 18 to 20-year-olds next to the general population so you could see the differences in the proportions. In fact, for the youngest Australians are actually even less interested in democracy than those of Fiji, India and Indonesia. Less than half think that democracy is preferable to any other kind of government. Just to see where Gen Y sits in relation to attitudes to some other basic civil freedoms, we asked some questions regarding the importance of various civil rights, a media free from censorship, the right to freely express yourself, the right to vote in national elections, and the right to a fair trial. Gen Ys differ slightly on the questions of a free media and fair trials, but very little from the rest of the population on freedom of expression. And very strangely, since it was in the same poll as our question about democracy, they don't differ on the right to vote in national elections, which intimates that somehow they see democracy as abstract and distinct in some way from the right to vote. So what could be the reasons behind this declining interest in democracy? When the results first came out, there was a great deal of conjecture about just what was behind those figures for young people. One of the most common responses was that civic education in our schools was sadly lacking, either in programs that were started and failed or programs that were never implemented at all. The second possible factor, I had some nice pictures on this slide, raised directly in our response from seasoned old commentators like Laurie Oakes, was that the tone of today's political discourse has significantly worsened and turned people off politics completely. There were two examples of communications mode on this slide. One was the famous Gillard misogyny speech, the one that got 2.5 million hits on YouTube, and the other one was that hideous menu created on a prehistoric medium paper and roneoed or photocopied. So a nice juxtaposition. Just examining the possibility, however remote, that it might be the tone of political conversation that seemed to be turning the nation's voters off democracy, here's something to think about. I had a chart here which showed a decline followed by a slight uptick in the number of people who followed the election in the mass media since the late 1960s. And in fact, there was a downward trend followed by a slight uptick, and that slight uptick seemed to have come almost entirely from a contribution from the internet in terms of levels of interest in the election. A different study from the Centre for Advancing Journalism, which actually just came out in May, lovely pie chart here, for those of you who like pie charts, had a big section who said of Australian population who said the tone of the debate had indeed become noticeably worse than it was in the past. sorry, even with my glasses I can't read it, but it looks like it's somewhere around 60%. The survey was conducted in March and mid-April this year, so it actually missed the latest salubrious developments in the conversations around politics and sexism, and one wonders how much worse that result would have been had this study been conducted in June. I'm going to flip through those because there's no point in that without slides. Look, a third possible reason was one described by one journalist in response to our poll was that democracy was the victim of its own success. Is democracy, in fact, becoming such a standard model for development, so much the norm that it's being taken for granted? Freedom House has been conducting surveys for the last 40 years and found that the number of free countries in the world has doubled from around 40 to around 90. Now, while, of course, the number of nations in the world has also increased dramatically, still the proportions are very strong. When you look at it on a world map, about half looks like free being defined as one country where there is broad scope for open political competition, a climate of respect for civil liberties, significant independent civic life, and an independent media. To a fourth possible reason, that is our supremely materialistic society, capitalism, consumerism. Here the theory might be that this generation has been provided with all the gadgets one could think of, from iPhones to Xbox, from Game Boy to Wii, distracting them from some of the other conversations they might be having about politics and social freedoms. Much of the literature, and there's a considerable amount of it on Gen Y, highlights their high sense of entitlement and self-worth. They've been described as, again, sorry, my glasses, entitled whiners who have been spoiled by their parents who overstoked their self-esteem, teachers who granted undeserved A's, and sports coaches who bestowed trophies on any player who showed up with a seemingly inexhaustible well of positive self-regard. There are studies, such as those at Brigham Young University, which say they're taking longer to transition to adulthood, perhaps because of the helicopter parenting we're subjecting them to. They're tech-savvy, impatient, short attention spans is stuff you've all heard before. They're not shy of exposing themselves on YouTube and Facebook. As employees, they're demanding, they seek instant promotion, flexible work conditions, frequent holidays. And they account for around a third of new credit card applications, and most of them are in debt, and they're not that interested in democracy. Speaking of gadgets and priorities, a 2010 Pew study on millennials in America and the internet in 2010 found that not only do they use their phones more, but a staggering 90% of them sleep with their phones. In Australia, it's not likely to be much different. The University of Canberra study in 2013 on digital technology in Australian teenagers found that by 18 years of age, 82% of them slept with their mobile phone on either always or sometimes. So materialism, gadgets, preoccupations and distractions may have pushed the importance of democracy and civil discourse somewhat down the list of priorities for this generation. A final thought about possible reasons for these ambiguous thoughts about democracy. A student at Melbourne University last year, in response to our poll, was interviewed for a press article and said, "China is a society and a state that functions without democracy, so is it bad?" And I note this was not a Chinese student. The thought being that what appear to be successful non-democracies, such as Singapore and China in our region, are we seeing a suggestion that young people are aware of political systems that are different and perhaps not so wedded to the idea of a democracy? So one of the questions for me is this going to change? Is the next generation going to come out of this civic disengagement and disenchantment? Well, perhaps not, according to a 2010 study on Year 6 and 10 students conducted by the Australian Curriculum Assessment. 18% of Year 10 students thought that learning about political issues in the press was important. Only 10% thought that supporting a political party was important, and discussing politics was right at the bottom of the list at 6%, who thought it was very important. In another question, these same Year 10 students were asked about their level of trust for civic institutions. 26% of them trusted the police completely. Only 3% trusted Australian political parties completely, i.e. less than they trusted the Australian Parliament, the state and territory parliaments, the law courts and the media. So I guess there's some good news in there for Parliament. I'm just going to touch on social media. I'm really sorry I don't have anything for you to look at here. But obviously we're all aware of the explosion in social media. Facebook is now used by half of the Australian population, 11.5 million people. YouTube by similar amounts. Blogspots, Twitters, Tumblrs, they've all increased by sort of factors of 4 or 5 times over the last few years. What does this enormous and rapidly growing use of social media actually mean for political engagement? I'd like to give you some time to talk about that. But I did want to touch on what's happening in America, because there's a lot more work on it there than there is here, I think, suggesting that the young social media users there are actually quite high in their participation in civic activities. They range from the sort of a quarter of them who might follow politicians on social media to 3% who might post links to political stories, or a very high 42% who actually post their own thoughts on civic issues. Another Pew story on American civic engagement is that younger Americans are just as likely as older Americans to engage in political activities. They just do it in a different way. They're much more likely to be politically active on social networking sites than in other ways, as Andrew pointed out, the face-to-face engagement. Australia's youngest member in this place, Wyatt Roy, said in April this year that social media may even smooth and improve access for correspondence, while politicians can react to constituents much faster. It's like speaking with a bigger microphone, he said. But he expresses his frustration, like you, Andrew, with the demands for rapid hair-trigger responses, the phenomenon of bulk emails, and he fears that good people will be scared off running for government when it exposes them to such examination and unreasonable demands. Winston Churchill famously said of democracy, and I didn't think I'd have to use it because I'm sure somebody would say this, but there's that famous quote that he said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all of those other forms that have been tried from time to time. But there's another bit to that quote, and that's rarely quoted, and that is, there is a broad feeling in our country that people should rule, continuously rule, and that public opinion, expressed by all constitutional means, should shape, guide and control the actions of ministers who are their servants and not their masters. It's the second half of that speech that fascinated me as somebody who does a bit of opinion polling here in Australia. In the process of taking the pulse of Australians in relation to democracy, there's no doubt that social media is a way of expressing public opinion, and it certainly is constitutional. So it's going to take us some time to get used to. We're going to have to figure it out if we want to maintain a vibrant and credible political discourse with this next generation. Thank you.
Very well done, Alex. I'm sorry about the equipment, but I think you painted a very clear picture in our minds of the problem. This is now your opportunity to become involved in this. The panel is here for your questions. I'm going to go sit in the middle. Do we have a microphone? So raise your hand. Someone will bring a microphone to you. There's a nice patient person sitting right here. Just say who you are, Andrews.
Hello, I'm John Ross from The Australian, and I want to just point out that I'm a very, very junior journalist, so I had nothing to do with that email that was shown before. Dr. Leigh, you by your measure, politicians are more polite than they've been at any time over the last 70 years, but at the same time we're hearing all these statistics showing that they're held in less regard and trusted less than ever. So I'm just wondering if the panellists could put those two things together.
John, are you aiming your question at Andrew?
Andrew, anybody who wants to.
Why don't you start, Andrew, and if someone else...
Sure. So it's only one metric, and the problem with historical analysis is you've got to look at a metric that appears over time. And so on this very narrow dimension, liars, unparliamentary, things seem to be getting better. But I think I'm inclined to go with Laura Tingle, who described the new scratchiness in Australian political discourse. I think the technological changes really privilege nastiness and negativity. No is a shorter word than yes, and I think we've seen a rise in what I perceive as hostility within the chamber, and certainly old-timers from both sides speak to the decline in informal socialising, in civility across the chamber. It's there, but it's weaker than it was.
Somebody else want to go before we take another question?
Is it maybe also that, and I think you actually did make this point, Andrew, it is actually bad behaviour is rewarded with attention. And in a much more media connected and so on world, that means there's more of it to be, more opportunities for that bad behaviour to be rewarded. And maybe if we stopped paying attention to it, or and I know the arguments amongst media people is around, well, we respond to, that's that circular argument of we're responding to what's coming up and so on and so forth. And we've got to play the story if that's the story of the day. But I've found in my dealings with media, in my current role, but in previous things I've been involved in too, that there is that pressure to have the conflictual story. There's no story unless you can have conflict, and the more abusive that conflict is, the better it is for the story. So we are sort of caught in our own bind too here.
Anyone else want to? Okay, question up at the top.
Alison Bronowski. My question is for Jeannie Ray. Jeannie, taking you back to your remarks about the army and women, doesn't it strike you as ironic that we go into Iran and Afghanistan, where we propose that what we're going to do is improve the status of women in those countries, and we're going to do it with the very army personnel whose senior officers and others are brought up with this culture? Seems to me that we are deluding ourselves if we think Australia's got much to offer in that regard. And I'd just like to remark that when I was in Washington in February, I met a young American colonel from the American Army who is a lawyer who's just done a project in New Zealand studying the recruitment practices of the New Zealand Army for officers, where they screen them for cultural awareness and gender appropriate attitudes and so on. And if they don't pass the screen, they don't get on. They don't get recruited. And their whole training program and everything about it is dedicated to that. And I couldn't imagine anything more different than the enduring culture of our army. Comments, if you wish.
Using military force to liberate women, has that really ever been the real reason? I don't think so, and I don't think it's and indeed the using of the arguments around freeing women in going into Iran or Afghanistan, and that they were very much propagated by, I think, President Bush and others who weren't on their local political record exactly standing up for the rights of women either. So to me, much of that is deceptive, and it's manipulative, and it also does play into as very traditional notions of going out to protect women who are unable to protect themselves, around men going to do things or have control over women or are actually criticising other men's attitudes towards women. It's very much bound up in all of these sorts of things about it. And indeed then the behaviour of military forces, unfortunately, down through the ages and currently, who are predominantly still men overwhelmingly, and the ways that they behave within that culture, not all, and I know many men have tried to fight against this, have been in armed forces, but there is such a culture of misogyny, such a culture of conquering is about conquering women as well. So, yeah, it is highly incongruous. But I also do applaud the efforts in the ADF to try and improve their way women are treated, the attitudes towards women. A young friend of mine's actually just joined the Air Force as a officer recruit, and what she's been telling me about the efforts being made to ensure, well, number one, the safety of the young women joining the armed forces, but then the sort of things that they're doing in their studies, for both the men and women, and the efforts being made at ADFA, then at Duntroon, and to try and address these things, and I applaud those efforts. I still prefer that we didn't solve conflicts by going to war.
Good idea. There's someone right here down the front.
Stephen, there's a boy right under the light you may not be able to see as well.
Yeah.
So trust me.
Good morning, my name's Jennifer. Outrageous thought. My young son, who's 6, does his news presentations on PowerPoint. the unprecedented access of young people to information of all different varieties from around the world is creating a seismic shift, both in education, but also possibly for civility and participation in democracy. But the current attitude is you can't vote till you're 18, and the strength and power to influence decision is from lobbyists, which I don't think employ 6-year-old boys. Perhaps we should lower the voting age. Perhaps we should look at engaging them in a political process very different to what we are now. I guess I perhaps might be showing my youth a bit, but I was talking in councils at 15, but at 35 I have less access, I believe, to influence political decisions than I had at 15. But where are those young people? Where is their ability to influence decisions?
The forthcoming referendum in Scotland about devolution has a voting age of 16. But I'm not sure it was all done for benevolent reasons. I think part of the reason is that young people are more likely to vote for it. But yes, Alex.
Oh, I think it's interesting that a call for lowering the voting age might come at the same time as a call for raising the drinking age. Just what do we think of our young adults and how mature they are? Look, the vote, the social media question is, I don't think, resolved in terms of whether it's encouraging participation in civil society or whether it's in fact degenerating the discussion. And I think we probably need some more time to absorb the changes before we make big decisions like that, given, yes, the juxtaposition between the two. On the one hand, we say they're terribly immature, and on the other hand, we say they're mature enough to vote. These are big decisions to make. And I think we're still looking at a media landscape that's in its infancy. It's evolved so rapidly, and I think we need to just sort of take a step back, not get too excited about it, and absorb the changes and try to work out how to respond to them. But I get you, I have young children too, and I reckon they can do a better job than me with the PowerPoint, given it didn't pop up today.
Do you want to go on? Because I just want to get one more question in, but you go.
Super quick response. Jennifer, as somebody who also has a 6-year-old son and admires the enthusiasm of young people to get involved in politics. Our biggest challenge at the moment is getting 18-year-olds to actually vote. At the moment, half of 18-year-olds aren't enrolled. Part of the reason is because it's only last week we finally allowed them to enrol online for the first time. So for all of you who know 18-year-olds, there's a 50-50 shot they're not on the roll, and they can finally do it at aec.gov.au.
Oh, very useful information. You heard it here. I'm told there's somebody under the light that I can't see. Over there. Can you get right in the center of that row? He's blinded by the lights. We can't really see you.
Top centre.
He's raising his hand.
This microphone gets through, I'd just like to touch on that last point.
Go for it, yeah.
Very briefly, I'd love your 6-year-old to stop equating democracy with voting. The reason you don't have a say, this is why no one turns up. You have 1/16 millionth of a say. You sit in a seat that the vast majority generally don't change hands. People don't feel heard, frankly, because they're not heard. There's actually better ways of hearing from people than just hearing from those at either end of the debate and having to pick occasionally the lesser of two evils.
So you don't think there'll be any message in the next election?
Sorry?
You think there'll be nothing heard in the next election, Ian?
I would say that my individual vote, I expect to see even a continuation of the trend. 3.1 million people didn't cast a valid vote last election. I'll bet you a Coke to stay away from alcohol voting age.
Sorry, that's not the question.
We'll go for that, north of that number.
Hi, Ethan Zisler from Canberra Grammar. I have a question for Alex. You said young people are a lot more connected now with social media and their voices can be heard a lot more frequently. So how do you think that's changing the relationship between the young person and politicians and government within Australia?
Yes, well, I made a comment in the presentation about Wyatt Roy's response to that, and I think Andrew has sort of similar feelings. It certainly is changing the nature of the conversation and not necessarily in good ways. But in terms of that data that came out of the states about the level of their participation in the political process, that's, I guess, positive in the sense that we're seeing them become engaged just in different ways. And that's why I think we need to step back and see a bit how this social media landscape evolves before we make big decisions. But it does seem at the moment that participation is high, but the tone of the debate has gone down and has made it more difficult and more destructive to the viability of the political process and the civility of the discussion. That answers the question.
Anyone else want to get into that? No? Yes?
I was just tempted to say off the back of Alex's comments that parliamentarians are engaging all the way through the cycle, and certainly in my own case, and I think it's reasonably representative, I respond to a couple of hundred emails a day with help from staff, constantly on Twitter, send out a monthly email update. So there's a range of different ways of engaging, which I guess goes a little to Ian's point as well. Democracy happens more than every 3 years.
Well, I'm afraid that we've gone well past our time, so can I please thank all of you for your questions, and the panel as well. We operate in a democracy where power is shared and where nothing gets done unless there's accommodation, unless people are willing to do trade-offs and compromise, and that's very difficult in an incivil environment, because once a person becomes evil, then how do you cooperate with them? So I think this is still going to be a very important topic, and I thank everyone on the panel for their contributions.